Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today we're checking out a new GeForce GPU, and if there was some kind of quick way that I could convey to you my feelings on this one, just put that there. I guess this would be it. Gee, this is pretty wobbly, Balin. I feel like I'm going to fall off here and crash harder than Nvidia's stock.
Oh, that's cold.
Probably a bit too soon for those jokes. I'll just move that aside. We're checking out the GeForce RTX 4080 Ti
Steve,
Super.
We've been over this so many times. It's a 5080.
Sorry. I do, of course, mean the GeForce RTX 5080. This is Nvidia's new $1,000 US offering, so it's coming in at half the price of the RTX 5090. Yeah, not the 4090 Ti, the 5090.
You got it that time.
I'm getting better at this job, guys. So with this one, the 5080 compared to the 5090, you're basically getting half the specs for half the price. There's half the cores, roughly, half the memory bus, half the VRAM, and almost half the memory bandwidth. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their CryoSheet graphene thermal pads, which are an excellent alternative to thermal pastes. They offer very high thermal conductivity with no liquid components, so they can't dry out and therefore don't degrade over time like pastes and even liquid metals. CryoSheet is very easy to use, it's extremely durable, and is available in a range of sizes to suit most applications. I've personally done some high-end GPU testing with CryoSheet, and the results were impressive, very similar in fact to that of liquid metal, but without the mess, and of course, no risk of drying out. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Nvidia's created a massive gap between the 5080 and 5090, which is no doubt an attempt to upsell gamers on the much faster and much more expensive 5090, plus it leaves them a good amount of room to release more expensive GeForce 50 Super Series cards in 12 months time or so that correct the obvious VRAM issues with much of the Blackwell lineup. So that's fun. In terms of specifications, the RTX 5080 is only a very minor upgrade over the RTX 4080 Super, Nvidia's previous generation $1,000 US GPU. The RTX 5080 includes just 5% more cores, which are clocked a mere 3% higher, and the only real upgrade here is the move to GDDR7 memory, which uses the same 256-bit wide bus, but the bandwidth has been increased by 30% thanks to 30 gigabits per second memory. Truth be told though, the RTX 4080 Super probably wasn't that memory limited anyway, so in reality the upgrades on offer here are likely going to result in a very minor performance improvement, and of course we are about to look into that. But before we do jump into the blue bar graphs, here's a look at how Nvidia's Founders Edition version of the RTX 5080 handles, and I'll compare it to the RTX 4080 FE card. For this testing I'm using The Last of Us Part 1 at 4K maxed out, and after an hour of load inside an enclosed ATX case, we saw a peak GPU temperature of 63 degrees, which is remarkable given how quiet and compact this graphics card is. The fan speed peaked at just 1400 RPM and couldn't be heard over our case fans, which are already very quiet. The cores clocked at an average frequency of 2655 MHz with an average GPU power draw of 266 watts. The memory peaked at 72 degrees with an operating frequency of 2500 MHz for a transfer speed of 30 gigabits per second. Now compare that to the FE model, which saw the GPU peak at 62 degrees and the memory at 74 degrees, while the fans spun at just over 1300 RPM. So it's clear that the 5080 design is a bit more efficient, at least in terms of size, but ignoring the physical size of these graphics cards, the end result is much the same. So again, great stuff here from the new FE model, but how does it perform in terms of FPS? Well, let's go find out. Starting with Marvel Rivals at 1440p, the new RTX 5080 was good for 108 FPS, which makes it just 8% faster than the 7900 XTX and 14% faster than the 4080 Super. It was also just 9% slower than the 4090, so that's not too bad given it should cost a lot less, but of course let's go check out the 4K results. Here the 5080 looks a little more impressive, well, ever so slightly more impressive, as it's now 16% faster than the 4080 Super and 12% faster than the 7900 XTX. So it is faster. It's not much faster in this example, but at least it's faster. Next up we have Stalker 2, and here the 5080 is just 4% faster than the 4080 Super at 1440p, while it was also just 3% faster than the Radeon RX 7900 XTX. Now, jumping up to the 4K resolution doesn't really change much. Here the 5080 is just 4% faster than the 7900 XTX and 9% faster than the 4080 Super, so pretty dismal numbers here, I would say. And the 5080 really struggles in Counter-Strike 2, managing to come in 4% slower than the 4080 Super at 1440p, and a rather large 13% slower than the 7900 XTX. It does recover a little bit at 4K, beating the older 4080 Super by a mere 5% margin, though it was still slower than the Radeon GPU, trailing the 7900 XTX by an 8% margin, so I think overall that's pretty bad. The God of War Ragnarok results were also highly disappointing. At 1440p, the 5080 was just 4% faster than the 4080 Super, and again, came in slower than the 7900 XTX, though only by a few frames in this example. The 4K data is more promising, as here the 5080 managed to pull ahead of the 7900 XTX by a 9% margin, and then the 4080 Super by an 8% margin, so still very disappointing results for a next generation product, but at least in this example it was faster. For some reason, the new GeForce 50 series GPUs are massively underwhelming in Delta Force, certainly much more so than other games. At 1440p, the 5080 was 10% slower than the 4080 Super and 12% slower than the 7900 XTX, so that's obviously very bad. And even at 4K, it was still slower than both the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX, and although the margins here were reduced, it's still a terrible result overall. The Space Marine 2 results are better, but even so, the RTX 5080 was just 6% faster than the 4080 Super at 1440p, and then 18% faster than the 7900 XTX. And then at 4K, we're looking at a 21% increase over the 4080 Super, so certainly one of the better results we've seen so far, and it was also 27% faster than the 7900 XTX. The Star Wars Jedi Survivor performance is also extremely underwhelming. Here the 5080 was just 2% faster than the 7900 XTX at 1440p, and 5% faster than the 4080 Super. The 4K results though are much more favourable, but even so, the 5080 is still just 15% faster than the 7900 XTX, and 19% faster than the 4080 Super. I think at 19% we're starting to get up there, though it's still a pretty mild gain for a new generation, but I think if we were seeing a minimum of 19%, that would be passable. A Plague Tale Requiem has more reasonable gains for us, certainly better than most other titles we've looked at so far. Here the RTX 5080 was 15% faster than the 4080 Super at 1440p, and 18% faster than the 7900 XTX. Oddly, however, the RTX 5080 was just 11% faster than the 7900 XTX at 4K and 15% faster than the 4080 Super, so pretty disappointing that the margins didn't grow relative to what we saw at 1440p. Even performance in Cyberpunk 2077 is pretty underwhelming. At 1440p, the RTX 5080 was a mere 9% faster than the RTX 4080 Super, and 7% faster than the Radeon 7900 XTX. Jumping up to 4K helped the 5080 a little bit, but even so, it was just 10% faster than the 7900 XTX and 16% faster than the 4080 Super, which disappointingly are some of the better margins we have seen for the new GeForce 50 series GPUs. Dying Light 2 saw a 12% increase for the 5080 over the 4080 Super at 1440p, along with an 11% increase over the 7900 XTX, so yeah, I think it's fair to say disappointing results once again. And at 4K, we're looking at slightly larger margins, but still just 18% faster than the 7900 XTX and 20% faster than the 4080 Super, which is about the biggest margins we've seen so far. Dragon Age has more weak gains for us, just a 9% uplift over the 4080 Super at 1440p and 15% over the 7900 XTX. The 4K data isn't much better, just a 16% increase over the 4080 Super and 18% over the 7900 XTX. It's certainly not nothing, but it's also very underwhelming for a next generation product, especially after all of this time. The RTX 5080 is only able to match the 4080 Super in War Thunder at 1440p, though that did make it much faster than the 7900 XTX, as the Radeon GPUs massively underperform in this title when using the default DirectX 11 mode. Performance is much better for the Radeon GPUs using DirectX 12, but for now that is not the default API for this title, and is labelled as beta, or beta if you're from the US. Then at 4K, the RTX 5080 is 3% faster than the 4080 Super, and 12% faster than the 7900 XTX. So again, very similar margins there. Performance in a Spider-Man Remastered is very underwhelming, and while the data might be mostly CPU limited at 1440p, that's certainly not the case at 4K, and yet despite that, the 5080 is only able to match the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX. Next up we have Hogwarts Legacy, and at 1440p the 5080 is just 12% faster than the 4080 Super, but also 5% slower than the 7900 XTX. That increase in the resolution to 4K does help the 5080, and now it's 22% faster than both the 7900 XTX and 4080 Super, which might be the most impressive margin we've seen yet. Moving on to The Last of Us Part 1, here the 5080 was only able to match the 4080 Super at 1440p, making it 6% slower than the 7900 XTX. Then at 4K, it was able to match the 7900 XTX, and was therefore 7% faster than the 4080 Super. So again, I know I've said it time and time again, but this is pretty disappointing. And I'm sorry to say, but the Star Wars Outlaws results are just as disappointing. At 1440p, the 5080 was a mere 3% faster than the 4080 Super, though it was 16% faster than the 7900 XTX because this game does use ray tracing with the ultra quality settings, and that of course hurts the Radeon GPUs because they're not particularly good at ray tracing. Then at 4K, it was just 5% faster than the 4080 Super and 17% faster than the 7900 XTX. Finally, we have Starfield, and at 1440p, the 5080 was just 2% faster than the 4080 Super, while it trailed the 7900 XTX by a 2% margin. Then at 4K, it nudged ahead of the 7900 XTX by a mere 3% margin, though that did make it 8% faster than the 4080 Super. So that's it really, mostly single-digit gains it seems. But let's move on to check out the average performance seen across the 17 games that we just looked at. Now, although I didn't bother going over the 1080p numbers, here's the average data for those of you interested. Basically, the 5080 was only able to match the 4080 Super here, mostly due to CPU limited results. But it does seem as though the Blackwell architecture struggles a little more than the previous generation's Outlaw resolutions, and this isn't always the result of a CPU bottleneck. Then at 1440p, we're looking at a mere 4% performance increase for the 5080 over the 4080 Super, just 4% on average or 5% over the 7900 XTX. But hey, that's better than the 2% uplift we got from the 4080 to the 4080 Super, so maybe things are looking up after all. Now at 4K, things do look much better. Sure, the 5080 was on average just 11% faster, but we have achieved double digits. But yeah, also, it's pretty disappointing, pretty horrible for a next generation GPU if I'm perfectly honest. It's just a 14% increase over the original RTX 4080, and when compared to the nearest rival from AMD, it's just an 8% increase over the 7900 XTX. The good news is, power consumption is quite good, at least based on our 1440p testing, as here the 5080 consumed anywhere from 4 to 19% less power than the 4080 Super, and considerably less than the Radeon RX 7900 XTX. Sadly, however, the RTX 5080 isn't anything special when it comes to ray tracing, only delivering an 11% increase over the 4080 Super at 1440p in Metro Exodus, though that did make it almost 50% faster than the 7900 XTX. So as we always say, if you care about RT performance, just get yourself a GeForce GPU. Then moving to 4K shows more of the same. The 5080 was 14% faster than the 4080 Super. The Metro Exodus results aren't that unusual though. Alan Wake 2 at 1440p shows that there is very little between the 4080 Super and 5080 when it comes to RT performance. There is some separation at 4K, but even here the 5080 could only distance itself from the 4080 Super by a 12% margin, so very underwhelming stuff there. The Cyberpunk 2077 data is more of the same. The 4080 Super and 5080 are comparable at 1440p, and then at 4K using quality upscaling with the Ultra Ray Tracing preset, we're looking at just 50 FPS on average for the 5080, and yet it was just 6% faster than the 4080 Super. Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered saw no performance difference between the 5080 and 4080 Super at either 1440p or 4K, both tested using DLSS quality upscaling. We're seeing a 9% uplift in Dying Light 2 at 1440p for the 5080 over the 4080 Super, which is surprisingly one of the better RT gains we've seen so far, and that margin is extended ever so slightly to 10% at 4K, but hey, at least it's 55% faster than the 7900 XTX. You're looking at just 70 FPS on average in Black Myth Wukong when using ray tracing at 1440p with quality DLSS upscaling, and that's 11% faster than the 4080 Super. The 4K data shows more of the same really, so pretty terrible gains really, and you can't claim a CPU bottleneck for this testing. Okay, so again, we didn't look at 1080p ray tracing data, but here it is using quality upscaling. The 5080 and 4080 Super basically delivered identical performance, making the 5080 almost 80% faster than the 7900 XTX. Then at 1440p, the 5080 was just 5% faster than the 4080 Super, while the Radeon GPUs are irrelevant here. Then finally, at 4K using quality upscaling, the RTX 5080 was just 9% faster than the 4080 Super on average, so I guess so much for an improvement in RT performance then. Okay, so in a perfect world where GPUs sold at the MSRP, or not so perfect I guess when we're talking about $1,000 products, but in a world where the MSRP was a thing for all GPUs, the RTX 5080 doesn't look terrible, though it also certainly doesn't look like a next generation product offering just 11% better value than the RTX 4080 Super. And for many months you could easily purchase the 4080 Super at the $1,000 MSRP, so this isn't anything new. Essentially, if you wanted roughly this level of performance from a 16GB GeForce GPU, you could have got it a year ago. And proving that point, if we look at the best pricing from mid-2024, and many of these prices were available for most of the year, if the RTX 5080 arrives for $1,000 US, it will be providing a mere 8% improvement in terms of value over a product you could have easily purchased at least 6 months prior. And not only that, but if you don't care about ray tracing, the 7900 XTX is arguably better value again, though I do think for $100 more, if it does indeed end up being $100 more, the RTX 5080 is still a better buy. But again, given how competitive older parts like the 7900 XTX and 4080 Super are, I think the 5080 is extremely underwhelming. So there you have it, the GeForce RTX 4080 Ti Super. Actually, jokes aside, it's probably not even that good. In terms of cost per frame, the 4080 Super was almost 20% better value than the 4080, whereas the 5080 looks to be at best just 10% better value than the 4080 Super. And on that note, I'm sure some will say that we should be comparing the RTX 5080 with the original 4080, but that's complete nonsense. That's because the RTX 4080 was essentially a failed product, and I'm not even talking about the unlaunched AD104 version. The 4080 that we ultimately got for $1,200 US was a joke, and thankfully the majority of you guys, so gamers, agreed, and that resulted in stock just sitting on shelves, forcing Nvidia to release the 4080 Super, and that was essentially the same GPU in terms of performance, but with $200 US knocked off the price. So a bit of an unofficial price cut there. Given that, it only makes sense to compare the RTX 5080 with the 4080 Super, and once you do, you quickly realize there's very little on offer here. Stuff like multi-frame generation can be useful, though it is extremely situational, and for the most part, you're not really missing out on anything there. And worse still, the truly exciting DLSS 4 features will be coming to previous generation RTX GPUs anyway. So if the RTX 5080 ends up coming in a little over $1,000 US, it'll line up more with the RTX 4080 Super in terms of value, and at that point it wouldn't matter too much which one you purchased. Of course you might as well get the 5080 because it's newer, but other than that, there's real no compelling reason for why you would buy it. And that being the case, you certainly wouldn't pay a premium for it, would you? So all of that said, I think in order for the GeForce RTX 5080 not to be a complete disaster and sit on shelves like the original 4080 did, it can't sell for more than $1,000 US. So hopefully the MSRP is more realistic than how the 5090 is shaping up to be based on all the leaked pricing that we're seeing. As a side note, for those of you with GeForce 30 series GPUs who have been holding out for 4 years now, going on 5 years I suppose, the RTX 5080 is 67% faster than the RTX 3080 for a 43% price increase, though I suppose if you adjust for inflation it's more like a 20% price increase. So if I were to recalculate the cost per frame adjusting for inflation, the cost per frame of the RTX 5080 has improved by 28% relative to the 3080. So again, certainly not an amazing upgrade after all of this time, and you are without question paying a premium for the 5080. And you could have achieved a similar upgrade at least 6 months ago with a 4080 Super. Overall though, what can you say? The RTX 5090 was disappointing in our opinion, offering around 30% more performance on average, or it was 27% in our benchmarks, but people found between 25 and 30%, so we'll be generous and go with 30%. And it cost at least 25% more money based on, the MSRPs. So if all of that was disappointing, I'm not really sure what to make of the RTX 5080, but I'm confident once reviews go live, we'll have a pretty good understanding of where the community is on this one, and not just reviewers, obviously what all of you guys thought about it. I don't think it's going to be too well received, but don't want to be overly negative. We'll see what you guys have to say, and we'll continue to form our opinion, I suppose. But you've got all the information, all the data now. There'll be many reviews. I suggest you check as many of them out as you can, and then you can form your opinion once you're armed with all of that information. But yeah, that is going to do it for my review of the RTX 4080 Ti Super. Again, leave your comments below. I'll be sure to read them. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe for more content, because we do actually have a lot of really cool partner card reviews coming up. So while this product may be underwhelming, if you're buying a GPU over the next year, 2 years, it may be one of the better value options, so it's worth knowing what the partner cards have to offer there. But I've pretty much said all the things. There's the join button, Patreon if you want to support the channel more directly and get involved in our exclusive live streams for members only, Discord server, behind the scenes content, Q&A stuff, then check that out. But if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time. But seriously, if I do fall off here, I kind of hope I end up in a coma. It's a bit morbid to say, but you could wake me up when hardware's exciting again. Or one of those, what is it, amnesia? They get, one of those, we could make a movie where a hardware reviewer falls off a stool doing a bit, gets amnesia. By the time he learns how to re-benchmark again, GPUs are exciting. Anyway, I'm going to hop down before I do end up with amnesia.